We are here on the beach of the Inter-University Institute for Marine Sciences, which is hosting us here in Eilat. The corals that build the reef are huge colonies of tiny animals of the order Cnidaria, the same order as jellyfish and sea animals. These tiny creatures, called polyps, excrete calcium carbonate that builds the corals and the entire reef. The structure of the reef forms a rich habitat. Speaking of biodiversity, coral reefs occupy less than 0.1% of the ocean surface, yet they provide a home for at least a quarter of all marine species. Coral reefs are a unique ecosystem found mainly in tropical shallow water. We are pretty far from the tropics here, and indeed, the coral reef of Eilat is the northernmost in the world. Interestingly, all this richness flourishes in some of the most nutrient-poor seawater. It is indeed most intriguing how such a complex and rich biological system evolved. On the one hand, reefs are like an oasis in a desert, but on the other hand, their biodiversity equals that of a tropical forest. Polyps are collecting food with their minute tentacles, but in this poor environment, this is not sufficient to make a living. Polyps live therefore in symbiosis with a unicellular algae that live inside them and provide much of their nutrition. Unfortunately, this symbiosis proves to be an Achilles heel for corals. When temperatures rise, as happens now due to global warming, the algae leave the polyps. This results in what is called coral bleaching and the decline of the entire ecosystem, as we will hear now from Professor Maoz Fein.
Over the last 30 years, reefs of the world are undergoing a major transition from beautiful and rich reefs to degraded reefs. Unlike reefs of the world, reefs of the Gulf of Aqaba and the northern Red Sea are in pretty good shape. And we think we understand why. During the last glacial maximum, seawater dropped below the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, leading to an increase in salinity, making it unbearable for all organisms in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aqaba, resulting in mortality of most of the living organisms in that sea. However, when sea level returned to more or less what it is nowadays, and that happened 7,000 years ago, and corals start to penetrate from the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea, they have to first settle in the southern part of the Red Sea, where seawater temperature is very high. People sometimes don't realize that 7,000 years is very short, too short to have an evolutionary process. However, they underwent selection for sure at the southern Red Sea, where it allowed only the thermally resilient genotypes to cross that barrier and progress northward and establish communities here. Corals can reproduce asexually, and this is something we benefit from because we can fragment small pieces from coral colonies down on the reef or in our coral nursery underwater and bring them to the lab, where we can propagate asexually many corals and generate small colonies that will later be used for different experiments. However, most corals generally reproduce sexually, and that's the most important reproduction for dispersal. Gametes, both male and female gametes, will meet, fertilize and develop a planula larvae, swimming planula larvae. Will then stay in the water column for about hours to 1 week, find a place to settle on, metamorphose and grow into a young coral and then an adult sexually mature coral. So what we're doing in our experiments is using the fact that we can predict when corals are reproducing, bringing adult colonies into our system, exposing them to experimental conditions of ocean acidification and climate change, and then looking at the performance of the brooded young planulae. We can then let them settle, look at the survival, metamorphosis, and the physiological performance as young colonies. What you can see here is this year's planulae, very, very young, about a few weeks old polyps, and about a year later they will be only a few centimeters in size. Which means that if we look at a fully grown colony, this is in fact a few years to 10 years old colonies that will then reproduce. All polyps are connected. So we have to remember it all starts from a single planarly settling on a substrate and then asexually dividing to create the whole colony. When some colonies are thousands or millions maybe in a huge poritis, millions of polyps, like a huge kibbutz, but in fact it's one tissue, one entity. I think the take-home message is if we are to secure the Gulf of Aqaba as a coral reef refuge, and we think it is possible given the state of other reefs in the world, we have to remove local disturbances. We know that local disturbances such as pollution, sewage, nutrients from fish farms, oil pollution, overfishing, all these are reducing the resilience of corals to thermal stress and ocean acidification. We have experimental evidence there. So we think it is possible. We have a unique opportunity to remove these local disturbances and secure the Gulf of Aqaba for future generations, where there's so much we can benefit from that jewel if we will be wise enough to do so. Given the future plans for the Gulf and the already high anthropogenic pressure on it, I think we have to act fast. We have no choice but acting fast, and to do so we cannot act alone, just Israel with its very little coast. We have to do it together with our neighbors, with the Jordanians, Egyptians and Saudis, because coral reefs don't recognize any borders, any geopolitical borders, and everything that happens in one country here is flowing to other countries. So a collaborative, well-coordinated effort to save the Gulf of Aqaba and the entire Red Sea will be the best approach to go.